All right. So this is the project MILD, which stands for Minimum Item Level Documentation of Training Data. And three people were spearheading this: Marcel, a lawyer, Alex, an AI researcher, and me. And to give some context, as we know, these large AI models like GPT are trained on billions of texts or images and or recordings copied from the internet. The problem is that most of this online content is actually copyrighted or personal data, or else it's actually just plain illegal. So these companies have been taking all that data, been scraping it from the internet, yet this data, there's a lot of stuff going on here where they might actually be facing legal compliance risks. For example, OpenAI, I've documented 12 lawsuits against OpenAI, and the first 9 of those lawsuits are actually about data rights violations, copyright in most cases, or privacy. So you might have heard of the recent New York Times lawsuit and all the ruckus that blew up. And the EU has not just been standing idly by. They're actually mandating public summaries of AI datasets for general purpose AI models or high risks AI models. And also the EU GDPR privacy law, and combined with the Copyright Directive, also mandates disclosure. Similarly, in the US, there's a US bill that proposes public summaries of copyrighted data. And in both cases, they're requiring the summaries of the data sets to be sufficiently detailed so people can actually exercise their legal rights. And so the question is, what does sufficiently detailed mean? What is like a minimum specification that satisfies the requirement of sufficient details? And that basically has to mean that the documentation has to comply with laws worldwide. So what we're saying is we came up with a specification, MILD, that actually is just the minimum. If any less is published in terms of a summary of a data set, citizens cannot uphold the data rights, companies cannot protect their intellectual property, and authorities cannot stop the spread of criminal content. And I'm going to bring you to the mastermind now, Alex, who actually came up with this idea.
So what is MILD? It's a set of JSON files that goes with the training data that you make. So whether you're training on private data or if you're releasing a data set publicly, we imagine that both of those would have their own JSON or JSON-L files, which is just lots and lots of lines of JSON, and each line corresponds to an item level description. So in an image data set, it would be each line corresponds to an image, or in a text data set, each line would correspond to some piece of text from the web. Can you switch to the next slide? So now step 1 of the technical process is companies will download lots of images, and they will run many different nodes in their cloud servers to download data. And then in step 2, they'll process this data typically internally to filter it, to check the quality, and maybe throw out some stuff, although right now not that much. Step 3 then is they'll be saving the data on disk and then further processing it. So what MILD does is collects data from each of these steps. So when you're downloading stuff, you will keep a record of which website you accessed a piece of content from. And then in the step where you're processing the information, we might additionally compute a hash of an image or a piece of text, and then save it into this documentation, which was JSON, and then we have the option of disclosing it. Now, we think there are many laws that require people to document their training data, but even more so require the disclosure of that data. So if we go quickly back to the JSON, we have things like the most important part. Stick to this slide. Each line is one image in this case, and the AISC item there in the middle is a content code, which is now an ISO standard. And that includes a perceptual hash, a content hash, a data hash, an instance hash. And so there's 4 different ways you can triangulate a piece of data without actually disclosing the data. So this allows people to filter out illegal content, or to check if their copyrighted images are there, or if they're potentially included from a privacy perspective. This would be a very minimum level of disclosure that's needed to sort of triangulate all the data without disclosing it itself. So we think that it's necessary for companies to document their data sets and training data like this, but also to disclose it. And Marcel now is going to cover the legal reasons, which was the bulk of the work, is the legal work to justify why this is necessary.
Just quickly,
So,
just to jump in there, the
well-
idea of the hash is like a fingerprint of the data item. So if you like an image, it's like you have a fingerprint of the image, so you can actually check back whether it matches with another, for example, child sexual abuse image. So that's the idea of the hash. It doesn't actually disclose the actual data, but you can people, including content rights holders, copyright holders, can actually check whether their data is in the data set using this perceptual hash. Sorry, Marcel, go.
So when it comes to a legal argument, this is particularly relevant and true for the EU, where mild would enable the enforcement of many laws that are not being able to enforce regarding copyright, data safety, and privacy, which we're going to overview now. When it comes to illegal content, the EU, and this applicates also to most other jurisdictions, processing child sexual abuse material is a criminal offense, and there's no waiver for of liability for AI providers for not knowing that they are processing that content. They have an obligation of duty of care. So they have to make sure no content gets leaked into their data sets or is processed inside their training data. So this would be a way to check if that has actually happened by authorities and third parties. Then when it comes to privacy, the GDPR, the GDPR understands anyone processing personal data as a controller. So AI providers, the moment they download personal data from the web, they become controllers and therefore are regulated by the GDPR. And Article 14 and 15 of the GDPR establish an obligation to communicate to the data subject that they have obtained and they possess their personal data. And mild would be a way to facilitate this communication to the data owner and to reduce the cost of this communication, as they would do it through mild without having to specifically send emails or establish another way of communicating that they possess this content. If you go into the next slide, the next requirement is the copyright and intellectual property framework of the EU, where the Digital Single Market Directive established a right to opt out from text and data mining practices. And through the definition of the EU, it's considered scrapping from the web this content for your training data is considered in text and mining practices. So if copyright holders enforce their right to opt out, they will be required to be paid in order to their data to be used, their copyrighted work to be used on their data sets. And if not, it is an infringement of copyright. And mild what would enable a way for copyright holders and artists and the other people that owns a copyright over their work to check if this is true and to check if their content has been used to train, for example, Midjourney or some other AI model. And even more important, the EU AI Act reinforces the requirement and forces the AI office to establish a disclosure mechanism for AI content for the training data sets of their AI models. So mild would cover this. It would actually fulfill this requirement that the EU AI Act has translated to the AI office and that the AI office has to establish. So we would be offering a solution for that also covers the previous points we just mentioned. And finally, with regards to the EU market, the EU places in their legislation a lot of power to IP rights, reproduction rights, and protection to copyright holders. So again, to enforce this protection and to help with licensing agreements and the ability of small copyright owners to enforce the right and check if the rights are being abused or not, there has to be enough level of transparency that mild covers. And Therefore, the existence of mild and enforcement of mild would facilitate artists in checking if their copyright work has been used and obtain better licensing agreements, even looking for collective licensing agreements that the Digital Single Market Act is something that points out. And this would help and prevent the erosion of IP rights and protect the current laws within the EU market.
All right, let's just say what we want to say. Alex has pointed out that disclosure of training data is happening already. There are already people doing this. There's already open source, saying not just open weights, but open sourcing of data. And we're going to ask companies and organizations to actually sign on what is a minimal specification for how data should be shared. So at the minimum, these organizations should actually share item level for the training data set a hash. So we can actually check whether there's child sexual abuse materials in there. Copyright owners can check whether their copyrighted works are in there. People who are concerned about the privacy can check whether their private photos and things are in there. And of course, if it was actually scraped from the internet, there should also be a URL in that item level disclosure, as Alex showed. So that's another way, like a backup way for people to check whether their data was in there. So this is like the minimum thing that we would require organizations to do. And it's a lot less bad for these companies than just sharing their entire data sets and like have other AI companies compete on taking the data sets. So they'll have to settle on this. And we're going to first just reach out to different companies and organizations and the experts in the IP space and other spaces to give feedback and sign on, and also reach out to politicians and standards committees like the EU AI office. Anything else to add, guys?